properly.
So how do I check with you?
check.
A bit tall.
What is your name?
John Peter. Do you want the full name? Or
Yeah,
not?
absolutely.
John Peter William Friedberger. How did that sound?
That's live. That's live. Brilliant.
Okay.
Grandpa John,
Yes.
it's midday on Tuesday, 31st May 2022, and I'd like to ask you some questions about your life.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, absolutely fine. Yeah.
We'll start with some simple ones.
Yes.
In what year were you born,
1937.
and how old are you now?
85.
Where were you born?
In Newport, Monmouthshire, which in those days was in England, but they redrew the boundaries, I think, after the war.
So it's now in Wales?
No, in Wales. It's now yeah.
You think yourself a British or English resident?
I definitely yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
What name are you christened?
John Peter William Friedberger.
Why were you called John?
I don't know. My father was called John, but he was always known, well, after he'd grown up anyway, by a nickname of Dick. So I didn't confuse with him, but he was John Cameron Friedberger. Why Cameron, I don't know.
Did you have a nickname?
Just sort of, yes. Things like some people called me Freddie, some people called me Friedel, some people called me Long John, and probably some other ruder ones.
Excellent. What were your mother and father called?
My father, as I said, was called John Cameron Friedberger, but known as Dick. My mother was Phyllis Grace, and her maiden name was Daniels.
What was your house like as a child?
Well, we moved, first of all, before I remember it, we were in near Newport, in the country somewhere. Then my father, he'd just come back from India. He was commanding a horse artillery battery. We moved to Bulford. My first memories of Bulford are about the beginning of the war, probably about 1940. My parents then had a very bad car crash. So my father was in hospital for a long time. That meant he was delayed in terms of going to the war. He got a staff job in York, so we then moved to York.
Mm-hmm.
He then went off to the war because he mended, but by then he was a brigadier, or became a brigadier by the time he went to Normandy in 1944. So we stayed in York until 1947. I was at prep school in Yorkshire, so I stayed there till 1950.
Mm-hmm.
And my father then moved to Essex. So we lived in Essex, in a lovely house which I enjoyed. Very cold, north-facing, just after the war, no central heating. We then moved, my father then, his last job in the army was in Portsmouth, so we moved to Portsmouth. When he retired, my parents lived in Southsea, and my father got a civilian job as bursar of the grammar school.
Wow. Do you have any brothers or sisters?
Yes, I had a sister, Rosemary. She was born in India in 1933. She never married. She was in the security service, MI5, which she would never talk about until very late. She had one big boyfriend, but it didn't materialise. And so she stayed a spinster. And she lived in number 47 Marsham Court, which she inherited from her aunt, a spinster aunt. And she travelled quite a bit when she was younger. She was in Malta, Cyprus, Singapore, and then later on worked, and she did 42 years altogether, and retired in 1960.
Wow.
She then enjoyed travelling and died in 2010. When she was about 76.
Yeah. What was your relationship like with Rosie?
Fine. I mean, we were never terribly close. We got on very well. We never had a row. She used to visit us a lot when we were abroad. She loved the sun. She was a sun worshipper.
Nice. What was your favourite subject or teacher at school?
I was pretty idle at school. I enjoyed history, maths, because we had a very good maths teacher at my prep school called Miss Cook, and history, geography, and maths, really, I suppose. But I was never particularly academic.
And is that because you enjoyed the subjects because of the teachers, or because you enjoyed working in those fields?
I can't remember now.
No?
No, I just drifted through school days.
What is the most important lesson that your parents taught you?
Oh, gosh. We, like a lot of my contemporaries, we had a perfectly good relationship with our parents. I mean, I liked them, but we were never very, we were far less intimate than you are with your generation. I would have said, so we talked about matter-of-fact things, but didn't normally talk about anything. We never mentioned anyone's feelings or anything like that.
How times have changed.
What did they teach me? That's a very good question. I think not to flap too much, just take things as they come, really.
What did you and your friends do for fun when you were young?
Well, I first of all learnt to ride a pony at my prep school. So whenever possible, I liked riding. I enjoyed sailing. I never played ball games, hopeless at ball games. And so riding and sailing, climbing trees. My prep school, we were allowed to run wild in the woods, and made dens, and learnt to set snares for rabbits and things like that.
Nice. Excellent. Useful skill.
Aren't allowed to do it now. I don't think you'd learn to set a
Oh,
snare.
really?
I doubt it, very much doubt it.
When you were young,
Yes.
did you have a group of friends? Did you move schools, or did you have a consistent group of friends?
Prep school in York, about 8 miles from York, called Red House School. Now, the 40 boys, now long defunct. I then moved to Wellington, which is in Berkshire.
Mm-hmm.
And I got one particular, I always got on with everybody. I was never bullied at all, amazingly, even though I was very lanky. And I had one or two friends, some of whom I still know, one of whom in particular is a great friend of mine called Richard Luce. And we've seen each other all over the world almost every year since then.
We might get touch on Richard later then.
Okay.
So I have a question that might...
And there's one or two others I still know and meet, not necessarily bosom pals, but I've got quite a lot of contemporaries still going.
Still going?
Yeah.
At 85 or around that age? What was your first job?
My first job, I left school a little bit early because I got bored, and I only got one A-level when I was 17, didn't stay on until 18. I then joined the army when I was just about my 18th birthday, and by then national service was on, so I would have had to join the army anyway, or the Navy or the Air Force. But let me think, I signed on as a regular. There I'd taken an exam which meant I was qualified to go to Sandhurst. You then went to a test which called the Regular Commissions Board, but you had to then join the army as a trooper for 3 months before going to Sandhurst. So my first job was a trooper in the army, and we were paid 7 shillings, about 33p a day.
Wow.
But that bought steak and chips in the naffy and a beer.
That was my next question. So in that first job capacity, what did you spend your hard-earned money on?
Well, we used to go down on once a week to the naffy.
What's the naffy?
The naffy is what is the naffy? The Navy, Army and Air Force Institute. But they run canteens and things for the services. I think it still exists, I'm not certain. And there was you bought a beer or two. We never drank very much. And that's about it, I think.
Has the beer changed since being in the NAFI
Well, I don't
to
drink
now?
there much now.
Oh.
Yes, the answer is you didn't have lager. Nobody ever heard of lager. I can't remember. I never drank much beer,
No.
but they had one, maybe a pint.
Yeah. So, going to the army at 18 years old was your first proper
First
job?
job, yeah. So they did, yeah, I mean, so the army, I only ever had two jobs. One was the army, and one when I retired. I worked for 10 years in the helicopter industry.
We'll get to that later as well.
Yeah.
I suppose we've jumped a little bit, but in that teenage period, did you ever get in trouble?
Well, at school, we were still beaten. Corporal punishment. So I can't remember why, but at prep school I occasionally got beaten by the headmaster.
Any notable ones?
We always wore corduroy shorts.
Okay.
But you did, after you'd been beaten, you went and showed off your stripes to your friends for some reason or other. And the last time I remember was at Wellington, when for some extraordinary reason, I can't remember why, I was caught throwing coal at the cricket pavilion. So I don't know why.
And what was how many stripes did you get for throwing coal?
I haven't a clue. Probably 4.
Probably 4?
Well, never more than 6.
Where did they hit
Do you
you?
want to shut this door button?
Yeah.
Always on the bum. Always on the bottom. Joanna, I think, was whacked on her hand, but we were always on the boys tend to be on the bottom.
It's striking midday.
Yes.
Your first 3 years in the army,
Yeah.
when you were, so you did your 3 months?
So I did 3 months up at the Capri. Then went to Sandhurst for 15 months, which was the course, a rather shortened course. Most people did 2 years. So I got commissioned as a second lieutenant at December 1956, when I was 19.
Why was it a shorter period than the usual 2 years?
Because they were reorganising it, and you stopped having to go into the ranks first. So they spent longer at Sandhurst.
How long were you at the army before you met Joanna?
10 years, give or take. A bit less than 10 years. I met Joanna at the end of 1964. So the answer is 7, 8 years.
7, 8 years. In that period, as a young man in the army,
Yeah.
where did you go? What did you do?
We started off after doing a course to learn how to be a tank commander. That was done in Dorset. I then went to Jordan, where my regiment, the 10th Hussars, was stationed, and they had Centurion tanks. And we were there. I was only there for 3 or 4 months because the treaty between Britain and Jordan was terminated. There was turmoil in the Middle East after the Suez War of 1956, and so the British garrison in Aqaba, which was then a small town with no hotels or anything like that, we lived in tents. We were withdrawn by sea and came back to Liverpool and then to Tidworth. So I spent the first 3 or 4 months in Jordan. We were then in England for a bit under 2 years, using our tanks on Salisbury Plain.
So were you driving the tanks? Like what was your role in the...
A Centurion tank, or indeed modern tanks, have 4 crew members. There's the commander, which is either an officer or sergeant or corporal. Then there's a gunner who sits immediately in front. There's a loader who is on the left-hand side, who loads the ammunition into the gun and operates the wireless sets, and a driver who's done forward. So, and a troop of tanks had 3 Centurions in those days, and the troop leader had 1 tank, the sergeant another, and the corporal another. So you got to know the soldiers very well. You're only in charge of 11 people.
Yeah. So, hold on. Were you in the tanks?
Yeah.
Really?
Yes. But I never went to war in the tanks. I can't tell you anything about that. But we did exercises.
Yeah.
And when you're all living together, hugger mugger,
yeah,
a lot of people get the impression that sort of cavalry officers are terribly rich and rare and spend the whole time drinking port in the officers' mess. But when you're actually on an exercise, and particularly obviously if you were in a war, you're all living together. So you either, when you get a chance to have a sleep, you either sleep on the engine decks at the back of the tank, or put up a little bivvy at the side of the tank. And you eat the same food and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
And you get very dirty, because tanks are dirty.
Sorry to hone in on the point. So there's 4 people who operate the tank.
Yeah.
Were you the first one that you described?
Yeah, I'm the commander.
The commander,
Yeah,
sorry.
the commander. But you have to learn how to do the other jobs, which everyone has done.
Yeah.
You know, how to load the tank and that stuff. And driving. Driving a Centurion was great fun. Because you had to double declutch all the gears. Great big heavy gears.
So what does that mean?
Well, that means the no automatic gears. It was a heavy gear train to go back to the gearbox. And you had to, the gear stick was in the middle here, and you had to, press foot on the clutch into neutral, foot on the clutch into the next gear, with the accelerator pedal getting the right revs, so that it kicked in.
Yeah. And how many gears does a tank have?
They had 5. The ones I drove, now they're automatic, so I don't know.
After Jordan and coming back to the UK,
then we went to Germany.
Germany.
With the same equipment. I was there for about a year and a bit. But by then I'd done 3 years with my regiment, so I was due to go away somewhere possible. And I volunteered to go to Oman as an infantry officer. Partly because I got interested in the Arabia from being in Jordan for a few months. Partly because I didn't want to get sent to something rather boring in England.
Fair enough.
So I then did an infantry platoon commander's course, which wasn't much use because it was all to do with winter warfare when I was going to the desert. But that was done in Brecon, on the Brecon beacons, and at Warminster. And then I went to learn a bit of Arabic in Aden, where there was an army school to teach colloquial Arabic. We then went up into Oman, which in those days, I won't bore you with it, but it was a very, very backward country. Anyone can read the history of Oman, which is quite amazing what's happened to it in the last 50 years. But it was very backward, but there's a very small British contingent helping defend it against various different rebels. Again, too complicated to explain.
Yeah.
But I was then 18 months as an infantry officer, as second in command of a company of our soldiers were actually Baluchi.
Baluchi meaning?
The Baluch is a province of Pakistan. Part of it had been owned by the Sultans of Oman, so they had a special relationship. And he'd always recruited some of his soldiers from Baluchistan, the southern part of Baluchistan. Most of them spoke Baluchi, although there are some Omani Baluchis who speak Arabic.
Right.
So, having got rather bad Arabic, nobody spoke English, except for there was one Pakistani called a Master Sergeant who spoke English. I tried to communicate in Arabic, but then the local officer who had to translate that into Baluchi, so I then tried to learn Baluch, which is not a difficult language, but there's no books about it. You have to do it. It's very quite hard to learn.
Yes.
To get it in. You just learnt it.
Yeah.
Learnt enough to be able to communicate. So therefore, I never spoke very good Arabic, which is a pity because I like to. Arabic's a lovely language.
And so you were in Oman?
Yeah, in Oman for 18. We did 18 months with a break in the middle. Then came back to Germany, where my regiment was still. We were there for a year when we went. The whole regiment went back to the Middle East.
Mm.
So by then I was a captain.
How were you travelling from Germany to the Middle East?
Well, on the way from Jordan back to England, we came in a troop ship. After that, all the army movements were done by air. So let me think. To get out to Jordan in the first place, we had to go from Southend for some reason to Malta, to Cyprus, then to an airfield near Baghdad, to fly down to Jordan. Over the years, air transport got a bit quicker. Mm-hmm. And we're now, for example, going out to Aden to learn Arabic. We went in a thing called a Britannia, which was a lovely turboprop aeroplane, and it only stopped once in Libya, in a place called El Adam in Libya, which had a British base in those days. And then later on, they got the VC-10s and things, and you flew in a lot more comfort.
Right, yes.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah. So we came back to Germany.
Thank you.
We then got converted to something called armoured cars, reconnaissance, small armoured cars, things called ferrets and saladins. And the regiment was split all over what is now the Yemen and Oman, and the United Arab Emirates. The squadron I was in Sharjah, just near Dubai. And the rest, the headquarters was in Aden, and the other squadrons were spread around what was then the Aden Protectorate, became the Federation of South Arabia, until the British rather ignominiously left it in 1967. I mean, it's a long, long story which anybody can read about. But the reason we were in Aden originally was as a coaling station on the way to India. And it kept its importance after the Second World War. But coming back to where we went to, I was in Sharjah, but after I'd been there about a month, I was the second in command of a squadron with 100 people and 5 troops of small ferry scout cars. There was a bit of a problem in the Dhofar province of Oman, at a place called Salalah, which is now a well-known place. You can go 5-star hotels and everything. So I was sent with 2 of the troops, 2 of the 5, in other words 2/5 of the squadron, down to Salalah. We flew down in 3 aeroplanes and we had 9 ferret scout cars and a Land Rover, I think. And I was there for about 3 months, which was lovely because I was entirely on my own command. The colonel came up once in that 3 months, and one of our ferrets got blown up on a mine, but the soldiers, one had to be sent down to Aden to be mended, but he returned quite quickly. Nothing serious, but enough to be interesting. Yeah. And we were guarding a very small RAF refueling station. Didn't have any aeroplanes, but aeroplanes came to get fuel and move on. Mm.
And running into I'm enjoying.
And now comes the interesting bit.
The period before Joanna and then pre-Joanna.
Well, now that's finished before, because then, when I was still in Salalah, I was called down by the colonel to be something called the Adjutant, and the Adjutant is the colonel's right-hand man. He sits near the colonel, does all the bump, and looks after the interests of the regiment. So it's a completely different sort of job. I didn't actually want to go down because I was very happy where I was, and I didn't want to go and sit in an office. But luckily, when I got there, not very much longer after that, a friend of mine called Simon Glenn Arthur had a water ski boat. He was ADC to the governor, and I went water skiing with him. And there were 4 of us, and Joanna says there was a girl as well, but I can't remember her. We arrived on a beach, and there were some other girls. One of which was Joanna, who was out there on a working holiday for a few months. and that's where I met her.
Sorry, where was this?
On a beach in Aden, called Goldmoor. Aden, anyone can look at it on a map, but it's basically just a crater and a rock with a lovely harbour, and the point of it is the harbour, and a few little sandy beaches, and this was on one of the beaches.
And what country is Aden in now?
Yemen.
Yemen.
Yeah. And it's not a place we'll go back on a holiday for. I'm afraid it's not. Things have gone from bad to worse in Yemen, as everyone knows.
When did you propose to Joanna?
Well, we got quite pally, but in those days, there was a curfew on. Our camp was about 20 miles away from Aden City, on the other side of the harbour. And there was a curfew because there'd been, at one party a little bit beforehand, a bomb had been thrown into the party, and certainly one English girl was killed, I think. So then we all had to be back before midnight. That meant leaving Aden at 11:30 to get back to our camp before midnight. So we, as I said, we apparently went to the odd party, and Joanna came to watch the cinema in our officers' mess, and she then went back to England in about February, about a couple of months later. We then corresponded by letter once a week. We then came back to England. The whole regiment came back to England on its way back to Germany. And whilst there, we saw each other a bit. We hardly. Joanna came out to Germany to the odd party for a weekend, maybe a couple of times, and then she sort of proposed to me, and I sort of proposed to her, just about Easter 1966. She was coming out to stay in Munster, where we were, and I went to meet her in Amsterdam. So we proposed there, and we bought a little ring for 5 guilders.
Jeez, you don't hear the word guilders.
It's a token ring.
Yeah.
A bit later on, we got the ring she's got now.
Just going back to that, Joanna and Yemen section. How long were you both in Yemen together?
Not very long. I arrived in December, and some of the time I went and visited other places. I mean, I think for Christmas I was up with one of the squadrons in the interior. Yeah. So we sort of met twice a week. For maybe, I suppose it might have been 8 weeks at the most.
And there was an immediate connection.
Yeah. Well, Janet, you can ask Janet that.
And so you proposed in Amsterdam.
And that was in April, just before Easter. I then came back to Joanna's 21st, which is in April 1964. No, 1966. She was born in 45. We got married on the 13th of August 1966 at Mickleham, which is where Joanna's parents lived.
Is that in?
Yes, in Surrey. Mickleham, Surrey. And we then drove. I had a very elderly, or it was post-war, but a Mercedes motor car. We drove out to Austria for our honeymoon. It rained every day. Then we were in a little flat in Munster, and Rosanna was born in Munster 10 months after we got married. So then the family started. That's the most important thing that's ever happened, obviously.
I will find this out from Bubba, but just one more question about Bubba in her early life.
Yeah.
Why was she in Yemen?
Because Joanna was an adventurous girl. She had been to several schools. She can tell you about that herself. She'd already been to Australia for a year, best part of a year. Travelled around the world. Went back to England. Was a Deb.
What's a Deb?
Ask some girl to tell you what a Deb is. It was becoming. It was a sort of almost a rite of passage for girls to have parties when they're 18. the original idea was to looking for a husband. I think. Anyhow, it was starting to fade away a little bit by then.
Yes.
You know, she'd done that. She'd worked doing odd jobs, came and got a job with a friend of her parents was going out to Aden because he was in the army there and accompanied with his wife and everything. And one of the daughters was a friend of Joanna's. She went and stayed with them and got a job. And when it was, incidentally, as far as I remember, when I was a captain, I've been in the army for 10 years, earning, say, £1,200 a year or something. Her pay was more than mine as a temporary civil servant.
Oh, yes, Bubba.
And she probably wasn't paying tax either.
Before we get on to the children,
Yeah,
we're just going to stay on the army for 2 more questions.
yeah,
And that is, can you tell me
yeah.
Can you tell me
Yes.
about these?
Yeah, oh yeah. Those are the top ones. Are my grandfather's medals. The South African Boer War, 1899 to 1900. Then his and my uncle, my father's brothers, medals from the First World War.
Mm-hmm.
The grandfather, he was a businessman. He was a stockbroker, but he was very keen on the army, so he volunteered to go to South Africa. Loved that. So when the First World War started, he rejoined as full-time, gave up his business. He was by then 47. He was a captain. He was at a training depot in France, in England, at Folkestone. His battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, was almost wiped out at the Second Battle of Ypres in April 1915. So he was sent out as a reinforcement, completely untrained really, to be a company commander. He was there for a week and was killed in a bombardment by the Germans, the gas and artillery. And in his battalion, he was one. There were 234 people killed in that one afternoon.
Wow.
And he had no known grave, so his name is on the Menin Gate at Ypres, which is worth going to visit one of these days. And my uncle, called Tony, incidentally, he changed his name at the beginning of the war, as some other German people with German names did, to Brian, which is his grandmother's maiden name, I think. He got very badly gassed and I think wounded, so he was invalided out of the army. And thereupon he always had to spend the winters in the southern hemisphere or subtropical climate.
Yeah.
So he travelled hugely, had spoke lots of different languages, European and African and Indian.
Yeah.
It was a very interesting fellow. So those are those medals.
Thank you very much. And now please can I ask you to talk me through some of the medals down here, which are
since then, also in the Lulu is Joanna's father's and my father's medals.
all right.
But they might be tied to the wall. No, you can go.
I'm going to quickly grab them.
Okay.
That was quite easy to
I'll
grab.
just have a drink.
Yeah. We will. You can pause as much as you like, by the way. So I'll get you some more water.
Again.
We're back on.
Okay.
Grandpa.
Yes.
Brief interlude. Please tell me about the medals you're holding up.
These ones are Sandy's, Joanna's grandfather. Joanna's father, your great grandfather. He was he wasn't a regular soldier, but he was in the supplementary reserve of the Grenadier Guards, and he served therefore only for 6 years of the war. He was one of 6 children of a Grenadier Guard general called Bulgy Thorne, who was another story, but there's a book written about him so everyone could read. Sandy had actually, of his brothers, his father, both his brothers, and one of his brothers-in-law were all in France and Belgium in 1939, 1940. and evacuated through Dunkirk. The only one who got wet was the general, who had to walk through the sea to get into a boat. Sandy, I know, said that he was taken off on a jetty.
Well, very civilised.
So he didn't get wet.
Very civilised.
But he then saw more action in the war than the rest of the family, because he then, having been in Dunkirk, he then went to North Africa, to Tunisia, not the desert rats, but in the fierce fighting in Tunisia. That's the Italy Star. He was on the beach at Anzio during one of the assault landings at Anzio. He then came back, and towards the end of the war, he was also in France and in Germany at the end of the war. And Joanna's born at the end of it. So those are the Second World War medals, Defence Medal, Victory Medal, and that is Emergency Reserve Decoration, which people who were in the reserve got if they served a certain amount of time.
Yeah.
So those are those medals.
Brilliant, thank you.
Then those ones these are my father's. He was in the Royal Artillery. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's perfect.
And he was briefly in the First World War, when he was born in 1899, and towards the end of the First War, you had to be 19 as an officer before you went to war. So his father having been killed, he would have probably gone to university by inclination, but he stayed in the army. He was briefly in the First World War with those two medals. In the Second World War, as I said, he didn't go to war until 1944, by which time he was a brigadier in a thing called Commander Royal Artillery of the 53rd Welsh Division, and he organised all the guns of this division from July 44 through France, Belgium, Holland, and into Germany. And he got what they call the DSO, Distinguished Service Order, which is that one.
Brilliant.
For there are two sorts of Distinguished Service Order. One is you get as a young officer for great bravery, just less than a Victoria Cross. And the other is for when you're more senior, is for leadership and getting things right. I think delivering the right amount of ammunition, shells to support the infantry. So he got it for that. Can
you just tell me about those two acts of bravery? That when he was a young man.
Yes. There's the First World War when he was 19. He was slightly wounded somewhere. I don't know any details.
And when did he get the distinguished?
1945.
And that was for getting the right ammunition.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's organising the guns of this division.
Right. Brilliant.
In 53rd Welsh Division.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, please can I ask?
Mine are completely different because I never saw any serious action. Might or might not have been shot at once in Oman from a distance by some rather elderly rifles across a wadi. So
yeah.
We did actually return some fire. But these are miniature medals because they're all one. The other ones you hang around your neck. And that is the Commander of the Order of the Bath, which they dished out in effect with the rations as a Major General. But after I retired from the army, my last job was Cyprus. That's the CBE, which I got after we were commanding the army or the armed forces in Brunei. But I also had another one, an MBE, which is a lower order after I'd been in Ireland. That's the General Service Medal from South Arabia and Northern Ireland. That is the Gulf War 1991 medal, which I didn't go to the Gulf War, but we were in Cyprus, and just before it started, for some reason they dished out a medal. That's the Queen's Silver Jubilee Medal, because at 1997 I was commanding the Royal Hussars, which was the amalgamation of the 10th and the 11th Hussars, and we were at Salalah, and the Queen's Jubilee Review involved the 4th Armoured Division, of which we were part, 3 tank regiments and 2 or 3 infantry regiments, and we all drove past in a flurry of dust past the Queen, and so that's the Silver Jubilee Medal. We're now in the year of her Platinum Jubilee, 60 years, so that was 25 years. That is a Brunei award for Dato Seri Pertama Daerah Kabilian Tabilai. And it's only when I was there, only the Sultan, his father, and me were given that.
Wow.
And there's a picture. He's got a sash, but it's up in the attic. It's that colour. That's a Brunei medal that everybody got for being in Brunei for a year, even though there were no enemy there. And that was the Brunei Independence Medal, because we were there during the time of the full independence of Brunei.
I feel like each of these medals has so many stories to it, so I might let you talk through all of the medals, and then maybe we could dive in.
Yeah.
So the next one, please. The next one.
Okay. So these are the ones that you hang around your neck. But you only have either one or the other at a time. That's the Commander of the Order of the Bath. That's the Commander of the Order of the British Empire. And incidentally, Joanna and I went to a service in Westminster Abbey on last week, which they have for the Order of the Bath.
Were you dressed up in your ones?
No, you don't. No. In the army, once you've retired, you don't wear uniform. With the exception, there's always exceptions. And the army, there isn't, in some ways, there isn't such a thing as the army. It's a collection of regiments and corps, each of which has different sorts of uniform. When I retired from the army as a Major General, age 53, when one thinks one's terribly old, you realise you're not actually very old, I became Honorary Colonel of a thing called the King's Royal Hussars, because my regiment had amalgamated again. And there you wear the uniform of a colonel, the full colonel with a crown and 2 pips. And you wear the regimental uniform, not the staff uniform. So the last time I wore uniform was 1997, when I handed over as Colonel of the King's Royal Hussars.
Right. All of the medals shown, were they all given by the Queen, or are they given? How are they given to you?
Well, the campaign medals are just dished out. Nowadays, they have, for example, people in Afghanistan, the regiment tends to all line up and get given them by their colonel of the regiment. For things like the Northern Ireland, the General Service Medal, I think they just arrived in the post. You've just given them.
Yes. Yeah.
And for example, at the end of the war, the campaign medals, people just were given them by the adjutant, probably. So more recently, things have become more formal. In terms of the particular honours, the MBE that I got after I'd been in Northern Ireland, where I did actually work quite hard, although it wasn't particularly dangerous. We were accompanied. I'll come on to Northern Ireland in a minute.
Yeah.
That I was given by the British ambassador in Bonn, because we were staying in Germany, and I hadn't got time to come back to England, so I just taken over command of the regiment. The CBE was an investiture in Buckingham Palace, given by the Queen. The CB, similarly, in Buckingham Palace, given by the Queen. And at one of them, Joanna came to both of them, all of them.
Yes. And
Rosanna came to one of the ceremonies, and Richard came to the other. Lucinda missed out, I'm afraid. And the Brunei one, I've got a picture somewhere, it was given by the Sultan in Brunei.
Is that all of them? Is there any more? No,
yeah.
Okay, brilliant. In terms of the one, which one means the most to you?
Probably the well, I suppose the rarest is the Brunei one, because I was the last British commanding officer of the Brunei Armed Forces. But the only one I feel I even started to earn was probably the General Service Medal. Because I spent 2 tours in Ireland, once as a brigade major.
Hold on. What year? Because the Ireland War is something we don't hear about.
The first time I'd been to Ireland, I'd been to Dublin to the horse show with my father when I was 10. But otherwise, I knew nothing about Ireland.
Yeah.
And but when I was aged about 34, 35, I was a major. I was suddenly posted as a staff job to a thing called a brigade major, the 8th Infantry Brigade, which was in Londonderry. It was after the worst of the troubles was 1971 and 72. By 1973, things had eased down a bit, but there was still a huge number of British soldiers in Ireland. In our brigade, which is one of 3, there were, I think, equivalent of about 5 infantry battalions and some other local forces. And we lived, most people in Ireland did a short format tour from Germany or England. But the staff at the brigade headquarters and some of the infantry battalions did 2 years. I actually did about 18 months as brigade major, but with the family accompanying us. Rosanna was by then aged about 7 or 8. I think she would be 83. She's 6. Lucinda was 3, and Richard was 0, just not long been born. We lived in a lovely house overlooking the River Foyle in Londonderry. Ireland is extraordinary. I mean, from our bedroom, you could see over the top of the bog side, which was the nastiest area in Londonderry, with full of ripples, IRA, across to a place called the Cregan, up on a hill, which was say about a mile from our house. But we lived a perfectly normal life. The only time I ever got shot at in Ireland was we were in bed one night, and there was a ping. You heard the rifle, but didn't think much of it. In the morning, we realised there's a bullet hole not far from our bedroom window.
Oh, jeez.
But it had been caused by some poor British soldier on guard on the bridge over the river, who'd had what the army calls a negligent discharge. In other words, his rifle had gone off when it wasn't meant to. So,
and he went into your bedroom. Very close to it. Yeah,
that's our story, and I think that's true.
Yeah, absolutely.
Memory can play tricks.
And so you think some of the hardest you worked was in Northern Ireland?
Probably in terms of hours of work.
Yeah.
Because it was quite responsible.
Yeah.
And you occasionally got run up in the middle of the night because something had happened. There'd been a bomb somewhere, or somebody had been shot or whatever. But yet, it was conversely, I never spent a night away from the children.
Yeah, how nice.
I always saw the children always to put them to bed, even if I sometimes had to go back to work, which is only 25 yards away from the house. So take conversations.
I think we can now talk about the children.
Yeah,
we've got to this point. Can you tell me about when Rosanna was born?
Well, like nowadays, everyone gets terribly organised getting married, but we got married. Hadn't really organised anything. Bit of a shambles. We never discussed particularly having children. We hadn't lived together like people do nowadays, out of circumstances and partly out of convention at the time. So we had a normal married life until suddenly, after about 2 or 3 months, we realised Joanna's pregnant. And so Rosanna was born. In those days, there was a British military wing. British military hospital was the wing of a German hospital, but entirely run by the British Royal Army Medical Corps, some of whom were absolutely excellent, and some of them weren't as good as they might be. And so the first birth wasn't terribly easy. I wasn't allowed to be there. It was all terribly regimented. I wasn't allowed to go. She was born in not long before lunch, and I was allowed to go in the afternoon, I think, for 5 minutes or something. So then we lived in this grotty little flat, because by the time I got married, there weren't any married quarters left. So we were in a German flat, which wasn't very big. And so Rosanna her first home was there. until about a year later we came back to England, where we lived in a cottage in Letcombe Bassett in Berkshire. I was on a course at Squadron, and then we went to Australia. So Rosanna went out to Australia when she was 18 months, and we came back when she was 2.5, just over a year. We travelled a lot in Australia. Soon after we got back, we already bought the cottage, North Walding Cottage, which you all know.
And
shortly before we went to Australia, because where we lived in England was a grotty cottage, and Joanna got rather bored and would rather been in the married quarters in Squadron. But I was a bit stubborn in those days and thought it was rather nice to live in an English village. Anyhow, the net result was Joanna suggested we bought a cottage, so we did, for £6,000, which I'd luckily been left a little bit of money by a great aunt, or given some money by a great aunt, and that paid for the cottage, my life savings, as it were. So we didn't need a mortgage. We wouldn't have time to fix up a mortgage anyway, because you're about to go to Australia. Anyhow, when we came back from Australia, I had a job in the Ministry of Defence, commuted to London from Whitchurch.
Yeah. On the train.
After that,
on the train. Did you commute on the train?
Did what?
How did you commute to work?
By train. It took an hour from Whitchurch, give or take. And I walked across the bridge to Whitehall. In the meantime, Lucinda was born, obviously having been conceived sometime in Australia. And she was born in April 70. We hadn't had time to get it organised at Whitchurch with GPs and things, so she was born in a not very satisfactory nursing home in Dorking. But luckily, although Rosanna's birth had been harder for Joanna, Lucinda popped out without any problem.
Middle children, I think they're the easy ones.
And so it was far easier birth for Joanna. We then lived in Whitchurch.
Sorry, what do you remember what date this was that Lucinda was born?
Lucinda was 5th of April. And Rosanna having been born on the 15th of June. Rosanna born 67, Lucinda born in 1970. So we were there at Whitchurch for almost 3 years, because having done 2 years in the Ministry of Defence, my regiment was in Tidworth. It was then called the Royal Hussars, and I was what they call a squadron leader for the next 18 months at Tidworth. A squadron leader has about 100 men and 15 tanks. We sort of the same Centurion tanks, which were, in my opinion, the best tank, the best and only really good tank the British Army's ever had. They tend to get designed by committees. Anyhow, the Centurion was a brilliant tank, excellent tank.
Yes.
And was sold all over the world. And during that time, we were on Salisbury Plain exercises. You did the shooting, fired the guns down at Castle Martin in Wales, near Manabea. And, it's Joanna. Hang on.
You're going to be Joanna?
You'd probably be Joanna, yeah.
Okay, we're back on.
Okay.
We're back on.
I'm not going to squeeze you in.
Take your time. And when we start back up, it's going to be going back to Mum, Lulu and Rick,
been born.
And how they've been born. Yeah. So whenever you're ready.
Okay. So we after I'd been in the War Office Ministry of Defence for 2 years, I then Lucinda was 1.5, Rosanna was 4.5, and I was at Tidworth with my regiment to become the Royal Hussars, amalgamation of the 10th Hussars and 11th Hussars, which had happened when we were in Australia. So I didn't go to that. I was the squadron leader, which is a major who has about 100 men, 15 tanks, with each has 4 men in it, one of which is the major himself, and a few supporting people and people to mend the tanks called fitters. We were in England for until June 1973. During that time, my squadron, all of us, not the tanks, went out to Hong Kong, where there was a stockpile of completely similar tanks to the ones we had at Tidworth, at a place called Sekong, up in the New Territories of Hong Kong. And we took them over from the Ordnance Corps, drove them around, had exercises with the Gurkhas, and fired the guns along the eastern side of Hong Kong, a place called Clearwater Bay, which is quite exciting. And it was paradoxically just exactly 1 mile from the main Hong Kong film studios run by a man called Run Shaw. Having done that, we then drove these tanks through what had just been opened. Everyone who now lives in Hong Kong would know the Lion Rock Tunnel, and went back to where we were, handed the tanks back in and flew home in time for Christmas. They were the last tanks ever to be in Hong Kong. They got sold to the New Zealanders, and after that there were no tanks in Hong Kong, so it was the last gasp of the British armour in the Far East. Anyhow, we then, as I said, I was the squadron leader in Tidworth. We then moved, at about that time, February 1973, Richard was born. In the meantime, in 1971, both my parents had died, my grandmother had died, and not much after that, one of my mother's sisters, her only sister, died. So we spent an awful lot of time organising funerals.
What a year.
And so it was a very busy period. And Joanna, at the meantime, was also half looking after our neighbours' children because her mother had had a nervous breakdown. So one way or another, I don't know how we managed to fit everything in, but we did. We then moved, we were going to move to Germany. I thought I'd be there for about a year. We bought a big duty-free car. But before we left, I was told we got this posting to Ireland, which I've spoken about already. And the quarter we were due to take over in Germany was deemed too dirty to take over. So the family were delayed coming out. The married quarter had been lived in by the doctor of the previous regiment, so not all doctors are very good on hygiene. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, having monkeyed out, the family came out. By then, Rosanna's 6, Lucinda 3, Richard 0. And for a few months, we had an au pair girl who, which was she? I can't remember. Yeah, we all went down to Italy in our car, had a holiday down in Italy. The first of many long drives on the autobahns of Germany with the family. And immediately, as I said, we got posted to Ireland. So in October 1973, we all moved across to Ireland. Rosanna and Lucinda, well, Rosanna to start with, and then Lucinda joined. I went to the local primary school, out McGilvin Primary School. 2 of them, I think, somebody had their tonsils out as well in the Altnagevil Hospital. So the other way had a fairly uneventful time.
So this is a German primary school?
This is Altnagevil. By then we're in Ireland now.
In Ireland, sorry, Ireland.
We were there until the end of the summer of 1975, when we had 3 months back at the Cottage before I got promoted to take over command of the Royal Hussars, which was, again, a tank regiment, by then something called a chieftain tank, which was more powerful, but it had a more powerful gun, but it's far harder to operate. And so I didn't enjoy it much. Mm. As a commanding officer, we had about 50 tanks. So you're still the tank commander of one of the tanks as the lieutenant colonel. But otherwise there were 3 squadrons. But very soon after I got there, we put the tanks away in the hangars and trained to go to Ireland as a infantry in an infantry sort of role. That took up most of 1976. That was 4 months unaccompanied at the end of 1976. By then, 76, Rosanna had started prep school at Windlesham, and Richard and Lucinda went to the local army primary school. So that was 76. 1977 was quite a nice, uneventful year, except for the Queen's Silver Jubilee, which was lovely. And then in 1978, having done my 2.5 years, I handed over command of the Royal Hussars and sent to the ministry. We moved back to the Cottage, and I had 2 years at a place called the Royal College of Defence Studies, which is normally attended by people above brigadier rank, but that I was there as what they call junior directing staff, helping to organise the courses. That was a lovely job, because I commuted to London, bicycled to Belgrave Square, where the office was, where the building was, had some very interesting lectures, very interesting people, and 2 interesting foreign tours, once to Africa and once to India and Thailand. So I enjoyed the job. We were nicely settled. Rosanna was boarding school. Lucinda started going to Windlesham whilst we were there, and Richard was at the local primary school.
What bicycle were you cycling when you commuted?
I bought our next door neighbour's ladies' bicycle for 70 pennies. And I used to bicycle down to the station. In
Winchester?
Bicycle down to Winchester Station, which is 1.5 miles away. On the train, in an old-fashioned diesel sort of train. Got out at Waterloo, and it took 15 minutes to bicycle to Belgrave Square.
In a suit?
No, I used to wear jeans. I changed when I got there. Yeah. Otherwise, I would have got in a sweat.
Yeah. Good idea.
So that was a happy period. By then, we'd started skiing with the family. So our holidays were mainly, we started going to Flegne, I think it was about that time.
So I think this is probably touching
hang on, no, that's before that. We hadn't started skiing. No, that's later on. Where did we go on holiday? I think we went down to Dorset or something like that. We then, as I said, and I'll get you back to front. So we were in. Yes, hang on. Yes, hang on. Yes, that was the second time we got it. We had started skiing. Yes, we went to Flegne. I then had to got promoted to full colonel, and did a job at Camberley at the Staff College, where I was in charge of a division of about 60 students and about 10 lieutenant colonels who did the talking. We were there for 2 years. When out of the blue, when I've been doing nothing very much important for nearly 4 years, I suddenly got approached and told that the Chief of the General Staff, the head of the army, wanted me to go to Brunei to take over command of the Brunei Armed Forces, which I never served in the Far East except briefly in Hong Kong. I'd never been in the jungle. I never know why I was selected, but for some reason, this guy, Dwin Bramall, who was a famous general, decided that he wanted to change the man who was there. Wasn't quite the right person. But he's a perfectly nice guy. I took over from him. So suddenly, in 1982, our lives changed completely. By then, Rosanna was at Bryanston, Lucinda and Richard was at Windlesham Prep School. Luckily, their grandparents, Sandy and Jocelyn, lived at Mickleham, which is only 30 miles from Windlesham. So they were wonderful grandparents and proxy parents, because we were 9,000 miles away. So Joanna and I flew out. I won't go into detail about Brunei, people can read about it. But the Sultan by then was Brunei starting to become quite rich. So the people who was lent on secondment to the Brunei Armed Forces were treated very well. So by then I was a brigadier, and we flew out first class on British Airways. There was no club class in those days, it was first or steerage. A great luxury, stayed in a Shangri-La hotel in Singapore for a couple of days and arrived in Brunei, where, as I said, we'd never been anywhere like that before. I mean, I'd been to Malaya, but never been to Brunei. And we spent about 6 weeks or so learning Malay on a little Malay language course. Luckily, Malay is quite an easy language to learn, colloquially anyway, because the grammar is very simple. And the words are quite easy to pronounce. It's unlike Arabic, which is all guttural. It's all quite easy to pronounce. We did that, and then I took over the job.
Phone's going again. Is it? Will that be Bubba?
Could be.
Is that on? And we are. Okay, we're live. We just landed in Brunei. You're doing a Malay course.
Yeah, just finished Malay. I took over the job. It was then called the Royal Brunei Malay Regiment, but Brunei was never a British colony, but it was a protected state. Brunei had been very rich and powerful in the 16th century, but over the next few hundreds of years, its power withered, and it was liable to be attacked by either Filipinos or Indonesians or something. So the British gave the Sultan protection in a very small way, because Brunei wasn't very important. In the Second World War, it was occupied by the Japanese. After that, things just drifted on until 1962, when there was a revolution or revolt in Brunei, inspired by the man who ran Indonesia at the time, General Sukarno. And the British, very quickly, they had a big garrison in Singapore, flew Gurkhas and British infantry into Brunei, suppressed the revolt very quickly, within 2 weeks. So the Sultan became, the then Sultan, the old Sultan, was never had to leave the country. He was very quickly, the revolt was crushed. That led, though, to 4 years of something called confrontation between Indonesia and Malaysia, as it had then become, and Brunei. Won't go into that, but as a result, after that was defeated in 1966, the British helped the Sultan build up his forces. He hadn't had an army in 1962 at all. He just had a police force. So by the time I got there in 1982, it was a force of about 4,500 troops, Army, Navy and Air Force. There were 2 infantry battalions, an armoured car squadron, had about 6 little patrol craft ships, and about 20 plus helicopters. The command jobs were being handed over to the Brunei people, so by the time I got there, there was, in effect, the command jobs had all been handed over. The only one that really hadn't been was the boss.
Yeah.
And I was the last British commander. In 1964, Britain gave up its responsibility for defence and foreign affairs to the Sultan, so that Brunei became a completely independent country, a member of the United Nations, a member of ASEAN, and its own thing. But it kept on the British connection in terms of selected officers and senior ranks, NCOs, in technical jobs. And I stayed on for 2 years until the beginning of 19 the very end of 1985. And by then, as I said, Brunei was completely independent. It was a very, very interesting job.
So you were in Brunei for 3 to 4 years?
3.5, well, nearly 4.
4 years.
Yeah, actually doing the job for 3.5 plus the Malay course.
And did Mum and Lulu and Rick come out and visit you?
Well, Mum was there the whole. Sorry, your
Sorry,
mum.
my mum.
The answer is yes. I mean, the hardest thing about it was we were so separated. So for that 4 years, we never went to, I think with one exception, a sports day at Windlesham. I think we might have gone to one speech day at Bryanston where Rosanna was, and later on Lucinda. So that we were divorced from them in that respect. The upside was they had wonderful holidays because it was a very interesting country. We had a hut in the middle of the jungle up on stilts, completely in the middle of primary jungle, to which you could only get there by helicopter.
Wow.
Or it would have been, and some of my Brunei friends, when they were younger, had to walk there before they had helicopters. It took 7 days to walk, half an hour in a helicopter. And so we used to go there for the odd weekend. And so they do something that no other child of their age was doing. You couldn't even do it with upmarket travel firms like Steps Travel couldn't organise it. And so they had wonderful. We had boats, and there were boats, and there were for going out to this, picnics on islands, and diving, and sailing, and all kinds. So they had wonderful holiday. The downside was, particularly in the winter, we put them on the aeroplane at 6 o'clock in the evening. They would get to Heathrow, say 7 o'clock the next morning. It was still dark. And met by Sandy and Jocelyn to take back to school. So that was pretty miserable for us, but also for them.
Yeah.
Because they didn't go first class, they went second class. And so we were there for 4 years, and I handed over to a very nice, very competent, tough Brunei brigadier when I left.
And when you put them on those planes on the way home, the way back to the UK to study again, what would you say to them, and what would Joanna say to them?
I don't know. We said, we'll see you at Easter. Look after yourself.
And how did you communicate when you
were
were separated?
We wrote a weekly letter. They wrote a weekly letter to us, we wrote to them. And that's what had happened since time immemorial. The children and their parents were in the separation. And even later on, yes, when I was in Cyprus, I'll come on to that later, I still communicated by letter because email hadn't been invented until they were grown up, really. So the weekly letter was the important thing. We never telephoned. I don't think we telephoned. Not to the children. I'm not sure we even did to the parents, to Jen's parents. But as I say, it was a very interesting job. The particularly interesting was when the independence celebrations happened, when all kinds of people, the Prince of Wales represented the Queen, together with an old friend of mine, Richard Luce, who was in the government and at the time, and various people. They had the President of Pakistan, Zia-ul-Haq, who got murdered, the President of the Philippines, Marcos, who got murdered, and there's the King of Tonga, who was a huge, great, lovely, great big man who had to have a special chair for him, because the Brunei Malays are fairly slim people. Yeah. And so that was quite fun. And altogether it was a very interesting job because as I said, we had the helicopters, we had some ships. I went to Indonesia, one of the ships. And then we came down to earth with the bump. On our way, at the end of 1986, the children were out at the time. We went to Malaya, went to Singapore. They wanted to stay in a 5-star hotel, but I took them to Raffles Hotel,
Oh, very, very famous though.
Yeah, I know, but at that time it had run down. It hadn't been refurbished.
Right.
And so it was pretty grotty. We then went to Penang, and they put them on the aeroplane from Penang to go back to England. Joanna and I then went across to Sumatra, spent 3 weeks in Indonesia, 3 weeks in New Zealand, and flew home. And I then was posted to Germany, to one of the few jobs I didn't really enjoy and for which I wasn't suited. I was a brigadier, assistant chief of staff operations for something called Headquarters Northern Army Group, part of NATO. The boss was a British general, but between him and me there was a German major general, a Dutch major general, and a Belgian major general. So it's a great bureaucratic organisation, part of NATO, which is towards the end, but still very much part of the Cold War. And as I said, I wasn't suited for the job. I hadn't ever done a staff job in Germany. I didn't know anything about higher defence planning. All my jobs have been at a low level. Anyhow, I survived somehow. And by then, the children were growing up quite fast. Richard was at Windlesham. Lucinda and Rosanna were Rosanna had left Branston and came and lived with us for a bit, where she had a job in the secretarial job in the headquarters.
So she was
18 by
18,
then.
yeah.
18, 19. And Lucinda was Branston, Richard was still at Windlesham. And this is when we went skiing. Rosanna got her job as a chalet girl in Monterey, and that's where she met your father. And that's their story to tell you. And so we were in Germany for 2 years. And when I was just thinking how very boring it was, I was suddenly offered a job of being promoted to go to Cyprus as the commander of the British forces in Cyprus. So it's marvellous, from a really rather boring job to something absolutely fascinating. So very, very lucky.
So what was the role in Cyprus?
I was commander of the British forces and administrator of the sovereign base areas. The sovereign base areas were created in 1960 when the British handed over. Cyprus had been a colony for a short time, taken over from the Ottoman Empire in the late 19th century. But it was time to hand it over, because the problem with Cyprus, as everybody knows, is a third Greek, 2/3 Greek, 1/3 Turkish, by identity, by race, and to an extent religion. That caused all kinds of problems, but they were nothing to do with me. But in 1960, the British very wisely kept 99 square miles of the southern bit of Cyprus in 2 bits as a sovereign base. In other words, the sovereignty is still vested in the Queen and Parliament in the United Kingdom. It's a unique arrangement. I think the Americans have something similar with Cuba in Guantanamo Bay, of notorious fame. So I was responsible to the British government, through the Secretary of State for Defence, for the administration of the island, of that 99 square miles. That included health and the laws. The laws, by and large, mirrored those in the Republic of Cyprus. For example, the drink driving laws. You didn't have the British ones, we had the Cypriot ones. And the money was Cypriot money, the Cypriot pound, Cyprus pound. And so I was responsible for that. At the same time, commanded the British forces, which was mainly a huge RAF station, RAF Akrotiri. I wasn't responsible for the operations, but I was responsible for security and administration, and a couple of infantry battalions and some armoured cars. And what is important to Cyprus, a lot of signals intelligence people, which I can't go into detail about, but that's one of the reasons it's very important. And as I said earlier, just as we were leaving the first Gulf War, when we went together with the Americans to liberate Kuwait, which had been taken over by Saddam Hussein. And so that was building up. And ever since then, Cyprus has become more important. It was very important in the Cold War as a base for V-bombers, nuclear bombers and intelligence people. Cold War ended about the time we left, but then it became important for the whole business of Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, because they've got a base in the Middle East. So it'll stay for quite a lot longer. So that was a very interesting job. I had lots of people working for me, a very, very nice RAF. Commodore was second in command, number 2. And there were various colonels and group captains to do all the work. But what we did do, had to entertain huge numbers of people.
Yeah.
We'd entertained a lot in Brunei, but there we had some staff. In Cyprus, we lived in a big house. Joanna had to look after all these people and their wives who tagged along. We had to have dinner parties. Nick Wills was our first ADC. He had to organise the dinner parties and things like that, together with Joanna and our staff, a couple of British soldiers on loan from our regiment, and various other local staff, including a wonderful Sudanese called Omar bin Bashir, who'd been in the same job for 30 years, and became a great friend.
Yeah.
And so that was a fine job. But then I was told at the age of 53, which is about average, to retire from the army. So that was that.
Yeah.
But then I kept the connection by being honorary colonel of the King's Royal Hussars.
Yeah. Brilliant.
So that's the end of the army.
That's the end of the army at 53. Only, saw a hearing for it. Saw a hearing for it. Lots of gunfire, like in terms of training.
Yes, because I never, apart from possibly being in Oman, there were mines on the road. I never was in a vehicle that was mined, but I seen one being blown up. Possibly being shot at, or we weren't being shot at from a great distance. I never actually, unlike my predecessors in the Second World War, or some of the modern army who've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, I haven't seen serious action, but none of my contemporaries did either. Because the only real war, there were a lot of campaigns like there were in the Radfan in Aden or in Borneo. The only war after the Korean War until the Gulf War was the Falklands, which on the whole my part of the army wasn't involved in. Anyhow, we were in Brunei, so I would never have gone there anyway. And,
it's better for it because we have you here.
Yeah.
Okay, quickly on Mum, Lulu and Rick.
Yeah.
We spoke earlier about the Autobahn and some of the long car journeys you took. Was it 3 people in the back? Did they fight? Were they?
Yeah, I mean,
close?
One thing is interesting that children who fight as young tend to get on very well when they're old. And, I mean, luckily, they all got on. Most of the time they didn't fight, but every now and again, particularly who sits in the middle. And it's roughly 400 or 500 miles from northern Germany to the Alps. You could do it in a day. I think we often need to stop, I think, for one night.
Yeah.
But it's possible to do it in a day. No speed limit on the German Autobahns, there is on the French.
Did you bring snacks in the car?
Did what?
Bring snacks to the car?
Yeah,
or did
I
you
imagine
stop
so. Joanna was very good at telling stories. And they listened to tapes, I think. We had a tape machine.
And did you stop for lunches and dinners?
Probably, but we tend to just drive.
Yeah.
So
and did
long drives.
Did you share the driving? Was it just you driving?
No, Joan and I shared the driving.
Yeah.
And by then, we stopped smoking. Yeah, by then we stopped smoking, so that wasn't too bad. We stopped smoking in the 1970s.
If you could describe in 3 words, or as many words as you want to, the personalities of Rosanna, Lucinda and Richard when they were in their teenage years?
Yeah, the personalities. Well, they never really changed, actually. I mean, your personality formed when very young, I think. I mean, well, you know them as well as I do. They're all different.
Yes.
What's really nice is they all get on so well together now. So we're very lucky because not all our friends' children do get on, and we get on with them very well with them all. But I mean, you know them as well as we do in terms of personality.
But I think a mother and father's eyes have a very different perspective.
Well, we're very lucky to have had 3 really nice children. I mean, health, for one. I know Rich's got problems with his tinnitus in his head. But on the whole, nobody's been seriously injured in an accident. They all had sight accidents. Your mother broke a tooth when she got hit by a bobble on a ski lift. Our first skiing holiday was down to in Bavaria, trying to teach them to ski when Rosanna would have been about, Rosanna was probably 8, Lucinda probably 5, Richard probably 2. And Lucinda fell off a bicycle in Salalah and that triggered her migraines. So that's been her problem. And Richard did something with a bench. From a bench, he had a very bad cut on his knee. But so they never had to go to hospital except for things like wisdom teeth, and and appendicitis. So we're very lucky in that respect. They've all been healthy and haven't had any huge problems.
And not too much pain to look after or raise.
Yeah, and it's amazing. Our first 3 Armitage's grandsons got into all kinds of scrapes playing rugby. And all learnt to drive successfully. None of them have yet had a service crash. And Lara's learning to drive. So Tom is already driving, he's a very good driver. So nobody's had a car crash. Quite a few of our friends, a child has had a really bad car crash and things like that. So we've been very, very lucky. Luck is the most important thing.
And where do you think luck comes from?
I haven't a clue. It's just some people have really bad luck for no fault of their own, and other people have more luck than they deserve. And I think I'm one of the people who have more luck than they deserve, because I've no illusions of the fact I wouldn't have been a great soldier in war. I would have not been quick enough, possibly, or clever enough, and in the peacetime army, a lot of people cleverer than me stayed at a lower rank and more able. It's just a matter of luck. And that is who you meet when you meet them. And I luckily never had a boss who I didn't get on with. And some of my friends had a job in which case the boss didn't like them, gave them a bad report, and they don't get promoted. I mean, it's an awful lot of luck in any bureaucracy.
Yeah, well, that luck sounds more like personal skills from your end to be able to have relationships.
It's avoiding trouble. I mean, one time there was one incident in Ireland, I could easily have been sacked. It was towards the end of our time there. I was pretty tired by then, probably. We were in bed, and the telephone rang, as it often did, at about, I suppose it was probably about 4 o'clock in the morning, and I answered it, it was my job to do. And there'd been a break-in at the Ulster Defence Regiment, was the local volunteer force of Ulstermen. There'd been a break-in in their armoury, and they'd stolen 200 rifles, or whatever it was, and some machine guns. I then put down the telephone and went back to sleep and didn't do anything about it. The brigadier at 7 o'clock in the morning was rung up 3 hours later by the general, who was a very fierce fellow. Well, he wasn't fierce, but he was not a very nice man. My brigadier, who was a splendid chap, a delightful man, he said, "David, what's all this about the armoury being broken into?" And the brigadier didn't know anything about it because I hadn't told him and done anything about it. I mean, he was so nice, and that is an example of how I could have been sacked.
Yeah.
As it turned out, it didn't matter, because it wasn't the IRA that had stolen these arms. It was an inside job of some Protestant thing.
Right.
But they hadn't taken them away and sold them. They buried them in a slurry pit, a pig swill.
Right.
They buried them in a pig swill. So they recovered all the weapons.
Oh, brilliant.
So by the afternoon, so it wasn't therefore a huge incident.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if it had been the IRA to capture these weapons, I'd have been court-martialed. Obviously, it would have been a terrible thing to have done. Or if the Protestants had had the wit to sell the bloody things.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that's typical Ireland.
The timer is going off. I think it might be the baked potatoes. Is that? Did you set a timer?
It shouldn't be.
No, it shouldn't be.
Well, if it is, I didn't put them on hot enough. Thank you. No, I'll just turn it on again. How very clever of you. We've still got 45 minutes to go. So I didn't know what the noise was.
Really?
Is it still going?
No, it stopped. It stopped.
I didn't know what it was. Okay, my voice is almost run out.
Yeah, so can I get you
your mother's book?
Hold on. I'm going to keep on you talking for a little bit more time.
Okay.
Johnson water.
Yeah.
Would you like a coffee or anything?
No, I'll wait for that.
Okay, we're coming to the end of it now, so it's all right. I can let that voice rest.
Yeah.
Maybe we'll just go for some more general questions.
Yeah.
What is your favourite city to visit?
Ooh. Well, there's nowhere like London. I like the country more than the city. There's nowhere like London, which, funny enough, isn't really a city. It's just a collection of villages. Unlike Paris, which is a designed city, really, by Napoleon III, or Berlin, or even Edinburgh, or Sydney, or Wellington. So I particularly like European cities because they've been rebuilt so well after the war, and a lot of them, of course, places like France were never bombed much. In Germany, they've rebuilt them brilliantly on the whole, and probably the same in Eastern Europe. Prague, for example, we've been to. But where else? Hong Kong, I used to enjoy visiting. I hated to live there. San Francisco, when I first went to the States, when I was 20, on my way back from Oman, I had 4 months leave. So I travelled through the Far East to Japan, got a lift across the Pacific with the American Navy, but in an aeroplane, American naval aeroplane. I landed near San Francisco, got a Greyhound bus across the States.
Wow.
Before getting back to Germany. So that was visiting places like New Orleans in the 60s and Washington. Kennedy was the president. New York in the 60s was different to anywhere in Europe, which was still recovering from the war. Anywhere else, you could say somewhere like Beirut or Jerusalem or
so all these places hold memories, in such fond memories.
Somewhere. I've never spent a huge amount of time in any of them, but I've visited quite a lot of places.
You've learnt from them.
Yeah.
What is your favourite meal?
My favourite meal now, it's probably changed over the years. I remember once, soon after the war, when there was still rationing, my grandmother lived in Mayfair, and we went to lunch at the Dorchester. First time I'd been to a really posh hotel. I was probably about 10. What do you want to eat? I wanted corned beef. When corned beef came, I was really disappointed because the corned beef I wanted was out of a tin, which you can still get, I think.
Yeah.
But instead, they gave me sort of a very smart pressed beef, which didn't look to me like corned beef at all. So I've matured a bit since then, and I like oysters. I like any sort of fish. I like a nice rare beef like we had a couple of days ago. I like avocado pears. When I no longer have any teeth, I want whiskey, avocado pears, scrambled eggs, and something like that. I think.
Sounds good. Damn good diet. Yeah. In terms of music, who have you loved to listen to throughout your life?
I used to have a gramophone. Right? No, I think it actually had electricity. So I liked 60s music, 50s and 60s. And more as one's got older, I appreciate what I call ordinary classical music, nothing fancy, but Beethoven, Mozart and those sort of people. But I don't think modern music does anything for me at all. But some of the sort of music like the Beatles, and there were some lovely people, like there's a wonderful woman called Françoise Hardy singing romantic songs in a sexy French accent, who Joanna and I went to see on her 21st birthday at the Savoy. Her parents took us there. And so anything in the 60s, but not much after that, I shouldn't think.
Brilliant, thank you. It's a good answer.
And we did go and see Christa Berg. They did a pop concert we ever been to. We took the children. Have you heard of Christa Berg?
No.
No, he was Irish American. But he's still going strong, I think. But otherwise, the Beatles, Cliff Richard, our sort of generation, my sort of age. My sort of age guys.
And I've heard you say before that you liked another French singer called Edith Piaf.
Yes, I've heard of her. Yeah, she's a bit like this girl, Françoise Hardy.
Yeah. Did you speak French, or did you just like the sexy accent?
No. I can't get my mouth around the words. I can read French, but no, I mean, a good French romantic singing with a girl was lovely. The best film, though, was the only American film I've really ever enjoyed, apart from probably The Magnificent Seven, was High Society. Have you heard of High Society?
I haven't.
No. They played it they repeat on the telly occasionally. It was Grace Kelly, who was absolutely beautiful, who became the Prince of Monaco, and Frank Sinatra. You heard of him?
Mm-hmm.
Louis Armstrong. You heard of him?
They were all in one film.
All in one film. Bing Crosby.
Wow.
And if you see it on the telly, High Society, watch it. It's absolutely beautiful. Beautiful film. And
how do you think you? Sorry.
Yeah.
How do you think you handle stress?
Stress. It's not a word I ever heard of until about 20 years ago. I don't think. When I realised, particularly at the end of the time we were in Ireland, I was very tired. You then realise that you probably needed a holiday. But that's as far as I've ever thought about it, actually. Until more recently, to digress slightly, a great friend of ours who died just before Christmas, aged 101. He joined the army as a 16 or 17-year-old. Rose up through the ranks, all through the war. He was in Normandy, where there's a short campaign, North Africa, Italy. He was wounded twice. He had his troop leader killed twice, at least twice. I remember when they started talking about stress from the Falkland Islands, I suppose it was. He said, I've never heard of it, didn't believe in it at all. But he was actually wrong. He said he never met anyone with battlefield stress. Well, one now realises that quite a lot of people from the First World War and the Second World War did suffer. But it wasn't really acknowledged. And I don't think anyone had heard, I did heard the word stress. Stress to me was a term to do with girders on bridges in physics.
Yes.
Stress.
Yeah.
So I think stress is a new concept. Everyone's stressed nowadays. But they don't really need to be. Because we're all very lucky.
What is your dream for your children and your grandchildren?
Oh, to be happy, and to have happy relationships, and have some, if they want to, have some children. And, I don't mind if they're dustmen, authors, classical violinists. I don't know what they do as long as they're happy and enjoy doing it. I think materials, I don't necessarily want them to be rich, but I would hate them to be poor. You don't need a lot of money to enjoy life.
What makes you happy?
Make me what?
What makes you happy?
I think I'm quite naturally quite happy. I just was so lucky. Yeah, I think one has just been so lucky. That's why you'd be very ungrateful not to be happy. And I'm very sad for people who aren't happy. Sometimes it's their own fault, but very often it isn't. Because circumstances dictate that they have a miserable time. For some reason, either a bad relationship or they're ill or whatever.
Did you cycle when you were a boy? And have you always cycled? When was the first time you got on a bicycle?
Well, I only bicycle, because cycling to me is drop handlebars and lycra. I like looking at the countryside when I'm going past. Yeah, but I used to love, we lived in York just after the end and after the war. And I used to bicycle all over the place, I remember. So I've always bicycled. I always had a bicycle at my prep school, because we had to bicycle down to collect the papers from the railway section, which was about 2 miles away, down a bumpy road, bumpy track. At Wellington, you were only allowed a bicycle if you were in the sixth form or if you belonged to certain clubs. So as I was hopeless at games and didn't enjoy them anyway, I joined the Beagling Club, which allowed you to have a bicycle. And in the summer, I joined the Sailing Club, which allowed you to have a bicycle.
Smart.
So I was able to go to the Beagling on the Saturday. Or we used to go sailing on the Thames at Wargrave.
And what's beagling? Sorry.
What?
What's beagling?
Beagling is hunting hares with a smaller version of a foxhound called a beagle. A beagle hound.
Yeah.
And you run after the hounds. But it gets you out in the countryside, which is a hell of a lot better than playing rugby, as far as I'm concerned, unlike my grandsons.
What is your favourite thing about being a grandparent?
The fun of seeing people grow up. Babies all look roughly the same, but one makes the right noises. But it's fascinating watching all of you six, year by year, growing up and getting older. For example, Sophie, who is now the youngest, seeing this funny little scrap. She's now turning out to be a really interesting teenage girl to talk to. So I think it's that.
And play chess with.
And absolutely haven't had time yet in her short trip to them.
Probably one final question.
Yeah.
And it's probably more advice just from you in terms of. Oh, sorry, that one's just stopped.
Okay.
Have you always whistled?
Have I always whistled? Yes, but I try not to because it annoys Joanna.
I think it sounds great.
I'm not musical. I like some music.
Leave those grandpa because I'll have to put them up. I'll put them up after this.
That's screwed on, was it?
Yeah, so I'll have to.
We'll do that later then. Okay. Don't worry about it now.
I'll try to announce it someone when they come in.
Yeah.
Very, very obvious.
Okay, last question.
Last question. Well,
yeah.
So two questions. One, is there anything else that you would like to say? That this could be a message that goes to great grandchildren or greater grandchildren, or it could just be watched by myself or Lara or Mum at any stage. So
as long as you can edit it down and cut out all the nonsense. 20 minutes would be probably quite enough. Otherwise, it would bore people rigid.
I certainly don't think so.
No,
Is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I just hope that everybody, even those who are not yet born, can have as interesting, happy and peaceful life as we have. But I'm not very optimistic at the moment, mainly because of the short-term problems of the economy in this country. And there's no doubt, as is written by almost all the books one reads, and I tend to like biographies, the position of this country over the last 70 years has been in gentle decline. We are not the power we used to be. And we expended so much of our energy and youth in the First World War, and again the wealth in the Second World War, that we never really recovered, which is inevitable. Every great empire, and the British Empire was great, eventually will decline. The American Empire we're now seeing is starting to decline. And God knows what will happen in the future.
Yeah.
But I'm extremely lucky to have lived when we have. I mean, our generation, and we often say to our contemporaries, I mean, almost always one of the subjects of conversation when we meet our contemporaries is, have you had your new hip yet? But it's also we acknowledge how lucky we have been, our generation, and you could say, being born into a nice, comfortable, middle-class environment. And we've seen so many changes.
Yeah.
And if the pace of change, I was talking about this to Tom yesterday, the pace of change goes on at the rate it has in the last 40 years, God knows where it's going to end. Because in 10, 20, 30, 50 years' time, when your children are middle-aged, we won't be like this. Something very big is going to change, but we don't know what it is. Whereas the pace has been slowly accelerating all the time.
So in this new world of potentially ever faster increasing change, what is some advice or principles that you hold dear that you would try
freedom. And you noticing that? What's this business about Ukraine about? It's people's wishing to be free. Okay, nobody's completely free, unless you're alone on a desert island without any clothes on. Because there are always constraints for people around you. So our form of government, Winston Churchill said democracy is a lousy form of government, but there's no one's thought of a better one. Because for all its imperfections and the fact that the politicians mess things up and they make us poor, they lose all the money and they get us into useless wars and things, we are free to express our opinion. And so many people in the world aren't. And God forbid that if in this country we're ever not able to express our opinion. And that's what the Second World War was about. I mean, if we hadn't stood up to Hitler, it wasn't just us, it was Hitler made so many stupid mistakes, particularly invading Russia. So therefore the Russians were able to take a huge amount of weight off what would otherwise have come direct to this country, because France has collapsed. It occupied the whole of Europe, bar Spain and Portugal being neutral. We'd still have been under some form of totalitarian rule. But we weren't, we aren't. Freedom is absolutely vital.
Any other principles that you have cherished or kept dear throughout your life, and then I can let you.
Just luck. That's the only thing. That's the important thing.
Value freedom.
Freedom and luck. Yeah.
Freedom and luck.
I don't think. Anyhow, thank you,
Grandpa. Thank you so much.
I thought you just gave me a couple of questions. Thank you.
Exciting.
And I'm going to show you. it's read. It's so wonderful that you actually be able to come over. And we're read it. Here's you have a look at that. We're putting the medals away.
So this is Mum's baby book.
Yeah, her baby book. So that's Joanna's. So it starts off literally with. All about it. Somewhere there's a letter. She said. That's not. Joanna's talking about a letter that she wrote to. She must have written to her mum. You'll come across it anyway. Mm-hmm. Have a look at that. Mm-hmm. I'm going to take these away. I'm going to lay the table.